So I'm Christine DeBella. I'm the program manager for ArchivesSpace. I've been in contact with many of you at various times. We're very glad to see you face to face. We're very glad to work with you I think all of you are in the educational program membership program. So we're very glad to have you in that program as well. Today we're planning we have a pretty tight time frame here, right? We have only 2 hours to cover a lot of different things that we'd like to cover. But, we're hoping that we'll be able to do all of that. And I think with this small group that it's going to make it even easier because we're not going to have to spend quite as much time as we might spend otherwise on introductions and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll just walk through the agenda. Okay, go over to the right tab. Okay, so this is our first session of Train the Trainer for Archival Educators. The idea of this is we're not trying to go very deeply into ArchivesSpace today. We're trying to impart enough information that you can feel comfortable knowing how to get more information if you need it, or knowing how to be able to give like a basic level of introduction to your own students when you get to that point. So our objectives for this workshop is that you become familiar with ArchivesSpace overall and how it fits into the larger archives and open source software ecosystems, that you'll know specifically what the ArchivesSpace application is and what it isn't, and how it can support the archival functions that you're probably teaching your students about. That you'll be familiar with the major record types and supporting records in the ArchivesSpace application, including things like accessions, resources, digital objects, subjects, agents, and those are the major ones. And then that you'll be familiar with the options for providing access to the archival descriptions that are in ArchivesSpace. Those would include the exports that we have, as well as the built-in public user interface. And probably even more importantly than all that will be like that you be aware of resources that can help you and your students learn more when you get to the point that you're really going to be looking at ArchivesSpace. Our schedule is pretty tight. We're going to start out with some introductions. I have a hopefully relatively short presentation about ArchivesSpace in general. ArchivesSpace, not just the application, but some other ways, other things that we mean when we say ArchivesSpace. Jessica is going to give a system overview to show you some different parts of the application. And then we've broken the rest of the agenda up mostly into groupings according to archival functions that we think you're probably going to be talking about with your students when you get to that point. So we have a short section on appraisal, acquisition, and accessioning. We have a little bit longer section on arrangement and description. We are going to talk about digital content and ArchivesSpace and how digital content is represented in ArchivesSpace. We'll talk about reference, access, and outreach, and then we've left a good amount of time for questions at the end. So feel free to hold questions to the end unless they're specifically about the things that we're talking about at that time. And you can use the chat for questions, or you can just, we're such a small group, you can just unmute and say the question out loud, and we'll be glad to handle that. But please try to keep your questions until we get to the end. Make them pertinent to the things that we're talking about at that time. And I'm sure as educators, you understand fully why we would try to do that. Okay, so that's the agenda. Any questions on the agenda? All right, so why don't we go through and do some introductions. I'll just call out names as people are on my screen. So Jessica, if you want to go first.
Sure, if I can unmute myself, off to a good start. So I'm Jessica Crouch. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace. So what I do in this role is I help our user community help themselves through training, documentation, educational opportunities like webinars and forums, that sort of thing. Before coming to ArchivesSpace, I've been with ArchivesSpace for 3 years. I was an archivist at the University of South Carolina, working in rare books and special collections. So all of my experience comes from working at a very large institution, using ArchivesSpace, and before that, Archivist Toolkit.
Next up, Colin.
Hi all, my name is Colin Post. I am assistant professor in the Library and Information Science Department at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Just starting my 3rd year here, but I feel like it's really my 1st year because the last 2 years were very strange. So I'm still sort of getting sort of a sense of the ropes and things like that, but I am sort of the main faculty responsible for archives and special collections courses there.
Great. Next up, Heather.
Hey everyone, so I'm an assistant professor at Kent State, and I generally teach the foundations of record keeping, also known as Intro to Archives, appraisal, and research data management.
Great. And your colleague, Karen.
There, this is Karen, and so as Heather just mentioned, I'm also at Kent State in the School of Information, and I teach, well, I've taught digital preservation and digital curation for a while, but I also teach an archival description course, which I've recently expanded. It used to be a 1 credit, really quick, here are the standards that we use, and now it's broader than that, and I have the opportunity to talk more about archival information management systems. So naturally, it's fantastic to have access to ArchivesSpace to be able to do that.
And we also have Sarah.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you all. I've talked with you all, and Jessica, I saw you at SAA, and a few of you I saw at SAA. So that was really great to see your booth, and also to talk about the new rollout, and I'm excited to hear that today. And so I teach the archival studies courses and emphasis at the University of Missouri.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift over to a relatively short presentation. I call this my stump speech about ArchivesSpace, but it's also, I think, valuable for people to understand that ArchivesSpace is a software application, but it's not just a software application. So what do we mean when we say ArchivesSpace? We certainly do mean a software application. It's an archives information management application. It supports a range of functions that are performed in archives and special collections. So things that we already mentioned, including accessioning, arrangement, description, preservation, and access. It did not come out of nowhere. It's the successor to 2 widely used open source applications that did the same things, but on a smaller scale. So we are the successor to Archivist Toolkit and Archon. The idea for ArchivesSpace was to take those 2 applications that lots of people were using and combine efforts. So take sort of the things that people really liked about Archivist Toolkit, which tended to be like the back end, back of the house type functions, a lot of collection management, and a lot of sort of sophisticated work in collection management, and the great things about Archon, which were having a public interface and some ease of use and things like that, and put the 2 systems together and not have to double efforts on developing those systems. ArchivesSpace is developed and supported by diverse archival repositories around the world. And I think, one of the important things about ArchivesSpace is that it was developed from out of the archives community. And one of the reasons it had to be developed out of the archives community is because not that many vendors at the time were interested in creating software to meet this need. So there are more vendors that work in this area now, but it's still like compared to if you think about like library management systems, it's still like a very small number of vendors that are interested, and the sort of the amount of energy and effort they put toward it is certainly less. And there are some other open source solutions as well at this point, but ArchivesSpace is certainly an important one. When we talk about ArchivesSpace, we also mean that it's a community. It's certainly a community that wouldn't exist if there wasn't a software application called ArchivesSpace. But the bringing together a group of people to work to create this application, and an application that reflects our values, is certainly unique in an area. So ArchivesSpace is very much standards driven. The underlying content standards for ArchivesSpace is DAX, but to the extent that DAX crosswalks to other content standards, ArchivesSpace does as well. And then we also have data structure standards that we support, things like EAD and MARC and EAC CPF. And all those things are important to our community to be able to do those things in a way that makes it easier to share information with each other. ArchivesSpace is also intended to be flexible and extensible. So you can use part of ArchivesSpace, you can use the whole complement of ArchivesSpace, but you can use like whatever makes the most sense to your own situation. It's also intended to be extensible. So you can start something out at one point, maybe start something out pretty minimal, and then go back and add information later over time, like as there's warrant for it. So whether that warrant is that you have more resources, or whether you're seeing that something is really popular or something is something people really want, you have the ability to add to it over time. ArchivesSpace is also customizable and localizable. So there is an out-of-the-box application, but there are ways to make it, look different or operate differently based on what you want from it. So we have a plugin architecture that is intended to make it fairly easy to make certain kinds of customizations. There are other kinds of customizations that might require like fairly sophisticated knowledge of code. But depending on what the situation is, there are ways to customize it. It's also localizable. So ArchivesSpace is built in English by developers whose primary language is English, but we also have ways to present the information in ArchivesSpace in other languages, as well as for people whose primary languages are not English, to contribute effort towards translating the information in ArchivesSpace. So we have an architecture that makes that possible too. ArchivesSpace is also intended to promote efficiency. So of course, there are many people still out there doing things, ways that they may have been done decades ago, including, using paper tools to provide access to their collections, or using individual Word files or spreadsheets. But ArchivesSpace is intended to provide an option for doing some of those things, maybe more efficiently and in a more centralized, standardized way. In ArchivesSpace, one of our guiding principles is that we don't try to be all things to all people. We don't try to build one application that can rule all other applications. We do what we can do really well, and what we can do really well is support archival functions from the perspective of an archivist and with archival standards. And then we integrate with other applications that people use to do their work that can do other functions really well, like say like a digital content management system or a circulation system. We integrate with those other things rather than try to build everything into one application. ArchivesSpace is sort of a little small organization, but it has the needs of any small organization. So we have an organizational home at Lyrasis that provides services and infrastructure that can amplify our community's contributions. And then the thing that I sort of want to emphasize is that ArchivesSpace is also an opportunity. So I'm sure as you can recognize that if lots of people, lots of types of institutions, lots of people in different situations are using the same application, it provides an opportunity to help people manage and make available as much archival material as possible. And you wouldn't be limited by being in a smaller type of setting or being in a setting that has certain kinds of rules. You have the opportunity to do the same thing that another kind of institution with different resources could do. It is a way by building standards into this application to make it possible for places that maybe are a little bit more resource challenged to adopt standards in a way that they would be hard for them to do otherwise, and to also develop shared best practices around some of these functions that are so common across many institutions. And it brings people from different sizes and types of institutions together to solve common problems that we all have. So ArchivesSpace is community supported open source software. So this is something that certainly there's been a trend in the last couple of decades to moving away from vendor products in certain areas, and ArchivesSpace is one of those places. In our situation, there weren't that many choices in the vendor area before anyway. But ArchivesSpace has a community-led governance model for sustainability. We're committed to keeping the code open and free, but of course it's not free to build and maintain an application. So membership helps us do that. You don't have to be a member of ArchivesSpace to use the application, but certainly members have the greatest say in its future, and membership provides benefits that help them do more with it and interact with the community around it. And we want to emphasize to everybody that what membership makes possible benefits everyone, whether they're a member or not. Educational program membership is a different kind of membership, as you all know. It's a free program. It's intended to support you and your students in learning ArchivesSpace. The biggest benefits are that you get access to our help center, which includes all kinds of information about using the application. We did add this benefit this year about getting an optional educational sandbox that's hosted by Lyrasis that may help some of you in some institutions that can be challenged by trying to find someone to install it locally. And the educational program membership, it has these great benefits, but it is intended for people using ArchivesSpace for educational purposes only. If you have people at the institution you work at or other colleagues that work more on the practitioner side and they're interested in using ArchivesSpace, they're not eligible for this program and they should really consider the general membership instead. As you all know, for the program membership, people nominate a coordinator, and the coordinators mediate all the access for their students. And we have our general email, which I think most of you know. All of us have reached us on that email. If you ever need more help, we're happy to help. And we have a lot of resources to find out more about ArchivesSpace, which I will not go into right now. I will turn things over to Jessica now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Jessica can sort of dive more into the application itself.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, you see ArchivesSpace, Christine?
I do see ArchivesSpace.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video too while I'm presenting, just to make sure there's no connectivity issues. So Christine, if I start to break up, let me know and I'll fix it. All right. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we are going to be moving very quickly. I will say right now, I will be saying frequently throughout this demo, check the workbook for this, go to the Help Center for additional documentation on this. There's just so much in the application that, or so much that the application can do that we're not going to be able to cover today. So I'm going to touch some highlights of the application right now, but just keep in mind, there's way more information already available in the Help Center, in the user manual, and in your workbook than we can cover. I also want to say before we dive in, all of the example data that you're going to see today is from real organizations using ArchivesSpace. They very generously made their metadata available to us for the purpose of education and training. So these are real collections at real institutions. Each collection is noted in a note where they come from. But as we're going through, if you see a collection where you think, well, I wouldn't have described it like that, or I wouldn't have put that in that field, just that, you know, that maybe that is the case, but it's a real world application of ArchivesSpace. And it's great to be able to have such a diverse set of examples. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to be spending this 20 minutes or so primarily in the staff user interface, which is what you're looking at right now. But if time allows, I'm going to pop over to the public user interface and talk about it briefly. So primarily as an archivist and for your students, you're going to be working in the staff user interface, which you're looking at right now. If you use the optional public user interface, that's another area where people working in ArchivesSpace are going to spend their time. There is also the back end of ArchivesSpace, which a sysadmin at your organization would manage, or if you're using one of the Lyrasis hosted sandboxes, they manage that stuff. So if you're seeing in any documentation, or if it comes up today, so we say, oh, that needs to be taken care of in the config file, or, oh, that's an issue in the back end. We're talking about the actual back end of the application where it's managed by one single person. It's not something that you can control from within the staff user interface. There's a lot of different sort of changeable things in the staff user interface, but some stuff does have to be done at the like database level. There is also an API, an application programming interface for ArchivesSpace in addition to the staff user interface and the public user interface. Not going to get into that today. That is a more advanced option for getting information into and out of ArchivesSpace. I think Christine may touch on it later when she's talking about imports and exports, but just know that there is an ArchivesSpace API, and frequently you might see across discussions the use of the API to do larger roles in batch. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and move into a demo or a functional overview of the application. Like I said, we're looking right at the landing page for the staff user interface. This is what you see when you log into ArchivesSpace. I'm going to be relying heavily on my notes today, because if I don't, I will run us out of time so fast. So I'm gonna be following along on my notes. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. We like to say that there are like 4 sections of the staff user interface, 4 command zones. The first is up here. This is where you can do some things like, you know, log out or log, you know, once you're logged in, you can log out up here. Also, if you are the administrator for your ArchivesSpace implementation, which I'm assuming most of you are, let's say one of your students is like, oh, it's just not working. I just cannot make this work. You have the option to become a user. So if you have each of your students assigned an individual user account, if you have a student telling you that they simply cannot do that, or they are not seeing that as an option, you can log in as them and confirm whether or not that is happening. So it's a handy little feature that I wanted to point out. This is also where you can invoke repository preferences, global preferences, user preferences, and repository preferences. We don't have time to get into those today, but that's where you can change how you would like for certain columns to be viewed, or how they list certain, you can change the order of your notes, that sort of thing. It's also, if you prefer to see ArchivesSpace displayed in a different language, you can elect that there as well. The only thing to keep in mind or want to point out is the way the preferences are applied is at the most granular level. Those preferences take preference. So let's say at a repository level, I have decided that I want certain columns to display when I'm browsing my accessions. But then let's say as a user, one of your students goes in and changes up the way that that view looks. Their changes will take precedent. So if a user would prefer to use ArchivesSpace in Spanish, even if at a global or repository level it's set at English, their preference will be what applies to them. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If someone's telling you that their archive space doesn't look like yours, they may have manipulated their user preferences or repository preferences. Also up here, you have the ability to select what repository you are in or confirm you're in the right repository. You may have one single repository in your sandbox, and then there's no need to worry about which repository you are in. But in practice, many organizations have multiple repositories represented within one single ArchivesSpace instance. So for example, when I was at the University of South Carolina, we had 7 repositories in ArchivesSpace representing 7 different departments and libraries on campus. If you're an admin, again, which you're going to be, you have the ability to move between those repositories. And I'll talk a little bit about user preferences in just a second, but for most people, their preferences are going to be, or their permissions are going to be applied to a single repository, so they won't be able to move around. But if you do have that permission, then you'll be able to move between repositories. I want to stay in this repository, so I'm just going to say that that's where I want to be. And that's now my active repository. You also have system preferences here. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do here if you have the correct permission. We're not going to get into any of this in terms of managing control values, container profiles, or location profiles. You can look in your workbook on that. We're also the ability to manage your repositories, manage your OAI PMH settings. None of that would be available to anyone that doesn't have administrator privileges. So don't worry about your students going in and mucking with any of this. You also have the ability to manage users here. So this is probably somewhere you're going to be spending some time as the professor if you are assigning individual accounts to your students in ArchivesSpace. And then if you hit system information, it just takes you out to like the technical information for the application. However, if you do not have the permissions that allow you to view any of this, then when you click on system, all you're going to see is this ArchivesSpace Help Center. So people without higher permission levels, their only option when they hit system is to take them to the Help Center, which has the user manual and user tutorial videos in it. So this is like higher level functions that people who are the administrators of their implementation or at the repository level are going to be making changes. This isn't something that every student is going to need to know how to do or want to do, unless you make a course assignment for it, I guess. Otherwise, they're just going to see the Help Center. Right below that, you see, again, this is a confirmation of the repository that you're in. If I click that, it would take me out to the information for the repository. So just the name, address, phone number, that sort of stuff, all the information that you would record about the repository, but I'm not going to click it. And then this gear menu, again, it takes you down to some more background jobs and preference management. So this is where you would manage your groups, so your permission groups and your user access. Not going to have time to dive into that today, but I would recommend, especially if you plan to assign or create user accounts for your students, go into the Help Center and read the user manual pages, but there's also some user tutorial videos on this that might help as you're creating your users and their permission groups. There's some out-of-the-box permission groups that may work for your purposes, or you may want to make a new permission group that is just specific to what you want your students to be able to do in ArchivesSpace. You can manage assessment attributes, not getting into that at all, manage your top containers. You also have options like transfer a repository. That's something you would, in the real world, would probably do very irregularly, if never, but if you needed to transfer a repository into another repository, you could do that, like maybe 2 divisions in the library merged or something like that. This is also one of multiple places you can elect to run a background job. You can also do that by going to the create menu, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. But background jobs are things like importing data into ArchivesSpace, generating a PDF, running a report, that sort of stuff. So that's where you can invoke those background jobs. This is also where you can download our bulk import templates. We have, and Christine will get into this later, but there's a lot of different ways to get information into ArchivesSpace that isn't just manually entering it in the staff user interface. And all of those templates are available to be downloaded right there. Very handy. Probably one of the most popular features in the application is importing things in bulk. So being able to know where those templates are is super handy. It's also where you can invoke out-of-the-box reports. So there are some canned reports in ArchivesSpace, and then there's also the ability to create custom reports in ArchivesSpace. So if you want to build out a custom report, you can do that here and create a custom report template. And then finally, you can invoke any plugins that you have enabled in your application down here. Out of the box, ArchivesSpace comes with the LCNAF import plugin installed, and I'll talk about that briefly when I'm talking about subjects and agents later, but not going to have time to demo it, but that's a handy tool for importing in your agent records. All right. And then the section of the application where you're likely to be spending most of your time is with the actual records themselves. So over here is where you can browse or create records. So I'm going to just click create. So you see when you hit create, these are all of the different record types that you can create in ArchivesSpace. What we're really going to touch on today are session records, resource records, and digital object records. These three record types are the meat and potatoes of of description. They're your material descriptive records. And that's why you see there's like this little line between digital object and subject. That's because all of the records under that line are records that more fully flesh out your accessions, your resources, and your digital objects. And we're going to spend time talking about each of those record types later. I will point out when I'm saying resource record, that's one of those like ArchivesSpace terms. Resource record, I'm just talking about like finding aids when we say resource record, and we'll get into that later. Your subjects and your agents, of course, are your subject headings, and your agents being people, family, corporate entities, and software. Those two record types, you link those back to your accessions, resources, and digital object records. They, in addition to locations, are shared across repositories. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and I'll talk about a little bit more when we're talking about subjects and agents. But that the intent of these records is you create the record once, and then you keep relinking that record where it applies. So you have the ability to create locations. You can either create a single location if you just need to say, I'm putting this box on this shelf, you can do that. Or if you want to build out your locations in batch, maybe you want to build out the entire building's holdings, you can do that in batch. And it's a really cool tool. Again, don't have time to show it, but there's documentation. You also can create container profiles. A container profile would be like you have a box that you use for all of your materials. You want to include the height, the width, and the depth of that, especially if you're using Space Calculator, which again, we're not getting into. And maybe you want to have a certain term you call that box at your institution, so you can assign that container profile, and then maybe include the link from where you order it, so that you never have to second guess, am I ordering the right box again? You also can create event records. Again, this is a record that reflects back on an accession, resource, or digital object record. The event might be this collection was processed, this collection was cataloged, this collection was sent out for remediation, and you would just assign a date and a person to that, like, oh, so-and-so processed this collection. You also have the ability to create classification records. Classification records are records that are sort of they are not subject or agent records, but they are a way to sort of link related materials. So an example that I see frequently is like in university archives, you have the Office of the President. You may create a classification that is the Office of the President, and then everything you get that relates back to that, you add that classification to. So they may be different collections, and they may come from different locations, or maybe represented differently in ArchivesSpace, but they all have that same classification. So if you're looking for something from the Office of the President, you can find it there. And then you have the ability to create assessments. We have a separate 2-hour training on assessments, so I'm not going to really get into this, but it is what it sounds like. You're able to assess the physical condition of your material, or the research value or display value of your material. You can describe if there's any, like maybe the material comes in with a lot of rusty paper clips and you want to indicate that. So you can create assessments for your materials. And this is another place where you can invoke those background jobs. So like I said, the ability to import data, generate PDFs, that sort of thing. And then next to create, you always have the option to browse. I'm going to show several browse screens as I'm moving through my demo. So I won't do that here, but you can browse all of the different record types that you have if you're trying to find a specific subject term or something like that, maybe. Let's see, catch up in my notes. All right, and then the final command zone that I wanted to show is this ability to search. So, Google rules apply. If you just type in a term here for search all records, it's going to give you a keyword search result for any records containing that. Probably the most simple and frequently used way to search records in ArchivesSpace, but you also have the ability to build out more complex searches. So you can add as many of these rows as you like. You have the ability to search with the Boolean operators and or not. You can define the search field you want to search by. So maybe I'm looking for a term in notes specifically, not necessarily just keyword. You can also search by your dates. Maybe you want to find something that was created on a certain date or updated on a certain date, and then you can provide your search text. So you can really build out some complex searches here if you'd like, instead of using search all records. Another option, like I said, would be to use the browse screens. And I won't pull one up now. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll pull up the resource browse screen. And you can filter by text to find a record you want, or search all of your tag subject headings, and then whether or not materials are published and the language of materials here. So filtering, if you know the record type you're looking for, like if I'm looking for a specific resource record, filtering can be another way to go. All right, I wanted to just point out a couple helpful things before I move on. So I'm gonna just open a resource record. Don't pay attention to the record itself just yet. We'll get into that in a minute, but I'm gonna open up this resource record and let it load. Okay, so this is a resource record. As you are looking at just a general record, you'll notice all over the place, you're seeing these little question marks. Everywhere that you see a question mark, that means that there is a related page in the Help Center that you can view. So if you're working in ArchivesSpace and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so confused about this resource record, all you need to do is click this question mark and it'll take you right to the relevant page in the Help Center, as long as you're logged into the Help Center and have a Help Center account. So that's a good thing to keep in mind for your students. If they're working in something and they find themselves completely overwhelmed, they can always, click those content sensitive help links that can take them out to the user manual. Another thing that's really helpful is you'll notice a couple have already popped up, but there are rollover tooltips within the application. So normally if there's a field where I don't know what this field is, I don't know what to put in this field. If you roll over the field's title, it'll give you some help. So out of the box content, or the out of the box tooltips are going to reflect back on DAX. So you'll see that here, it defines what the field is, and then it tells you where it's pulling this requirement from DAX and giving you some examples. In general, I will say that these tooltips are editable. So if you're working in an institution that doesn't use DAX, maybe uses a different descriptive standard, or maybe you have at your institution a very specific rule for a field, like we never, ever, 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 ever use this field, you can edit these to reflect your internal practice as well. But that's more for, down the road, not necessarily for a class. I don't think you want to be editing the rollover tooltips. Let's see. The last thing I wanted to mention before I check on the time and see if we want to go to the PUI is this something that I thought might be relevant for classes, and that's within ArchivesSpace, if you are editing a record. So right now I have a record open in edit mode, and someone else also has the record and is editing it. ArchivesSpace operates under a first to save wins sort of mentality. So if you have a student assignment, maybe a group project where they're all supposed to be working on the same record, and they've all waited until the last minute, and they're doing it at the same time, if someone saves the work that they were doing while someone else is still working in the record, all of the work that the person who did not save, all of that work will be lost. So just keep that in mind, especially if you're planning on doing like group assignments and stuff. It would be perfectly fine to have them working in the same collection, and maybe one's working in one series and a student's working in another series. That would be fine. If they are working on the same record and working over each other, that's when it could get into complications, and someone's work would ultimately be lost. So I just wanted to point that out. How are we on time, Christine?
You've got like 2 minutes left. So depending on like how much more you're planning to cover.
I have 2 minutes total left.
2 minutes. I can probably give you a couple more.
Okay, well I can do, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very briefly just show, I went back to the home screen of the staff user interface, everybody. So what I did is I went to the little home and went home. But if you ever find yourself lost in the application, you can always just follow the breadcrumbs too and take yourself home. So this is, again, we're back at the staff user interface. ArchivesSpace does have a public user interface. You can get to it by going to the direct link, but if you're in the staff user interface, you can always just hit view interface. And so this is the out of the box, no customizations whatsoever, public user interface for ArchivesSpace. It's great because it makes materials discoverable to users online. It is optional, so no organization is required to use the public user interface. Some organizations like to use the public user interface. Some choose to export their metadata and put it into other systems. Some just use a different front end. I think Christine's going to talk about that later, but this is the default public user interface for ArchivesSpace. Since I'm running out of time, I won't dig around in here, but I will say that ArchivesSpace automatically indexes all information. So if you choose to publish your materials to the public user interface, it publishes automatically. It's already there right away. That being said, it is a choice. And you'll see as we're doing demos, you have to use the publish checkbox in the staff user interface to make those materials available in the public user interface. ArchivesSpace doesn't automatically publish your records except for subjects, and I'll point that out later, but it does not publish your finding aids for you or anything like that. So you don't have to worry about any of your material becoming available before you're ready. You need to hit that publish button on your own. Again, just like the staff user interface, but a little more options. You can search across all of your collections within the public user interface. All of your repositories are going to be represented. So in this demo, we have 2 repositories. So when you're searching across collections in the public user interface, your results are going to be for all of the repositories within your implementation. Whereas if you're in the staff user interface, your results are only going to be for the repository that you've selected to be in. And when you're browsing, same thing, you're browsing all of the collections across the entirety of your ArchivesSpace implementation, not just your repository. I went a little bit over, but I think I just wanted to make sure you saw that the public user interface exists. Anything else to add, Christine?
No, I don't think so. But we will, if people have questions for Jessica right now, we can probably take a few, but we did leave time at the end.
Yeah, but if there are any questions about what I just demoed, I definitely want to clarify stuff before we get too far along. See something in the chat. Oh, no questions. All right. Perfect. I like that question. All right.
Okay, so then we will march on to the next section.
All right.
Great. Thank you. And you know, we typically like do like this kind of basic introduction to ArchivesSpace. We used to have a 2-day course in it, and then we had a 4-session course when we moved online. So we're covering a lot of ground, but we also have a lot more resources online to help you return. So we're just giving you like a taste today and providing you resources that are going to help you in the future when you need more. So I am going to start out, let me share my screen. I'm going to start out with the piece where we talk about appraisal and accessioning and acquisitions. So all those things that start with an A that probably like come pretty early in your intro to archives class. So ArchivesSpace does provide ways to record information about those activities, those functions. Primarily the part of the application that would be used related to those functions would be the accessions module. So accessioning is the process of taking physical and intellectual control of material that comes into the repository. Even before you get to the step of acquisition of accessions, you'd be looking at what you actually want to acquire. And thinking through, you know, different appraisal strategies that help you decide what are you going to acquire. acquisitions and appraisal can also be recorded in the accessions record in ArchivesSpace. And what Jessica was talking about related to our assessment module, that might also be an area that people might want to document appraisal decisions. So our accessions record, like a lot of our records in ArchivesSpace, is pretty basic. There's a lot that you can do, and actually, let me get logged back in here. There's a lot that you can do, but there's not a lot that you have to do to make a valid accession in ArchivesSpace. The accessions module of ArchivesSpace is not based on a specific metadata standard because at the time that ArchivesSpace was first being built, there wasn't really an accession standard out there, but there certainly were plenty of best practices for accessioning. There has been in the last few years the Canadian accessioning standard. And we are looking at ways to incorporate that into ArchivesSpace a little bit more. But when we looked at it and when we mapped it to ArchivesSpace, ArchivesSpace reflects that standard pretty well already, probably because how we do accession records in here is based on best practices that have been around for quite a while. So accessioning, there's the only information that you actually have to record in ArchivesSpace to make a valid accession is an identifier, a unique identifier that distinguishes it from other accessions in the system. From there, you can do all kinds of things. It certainly would be recommended to also record a title, also record an accession date, also record some kind of description of what's in there. But the only thing you absolutely have to put in there is an identifier. So here you can see the different fields here. Probably the most commonly used are the things that are closer to the top. And then as you get further down, there's sort of added value information for an accession. You can add things like provenance if you're working in a records management context. You can record things about records retention rules. There is a place to indicate the resource type, so whether whether these are papers, records, or collection or publications, and some of the sort of traditional definitions of those things. We did in the last few years add places to record language information in a standardized way and script information in a standardized way to make the accession record maybe map a little bit better to DAX principles for what makes a minimal record. And then there's also places that you can record information about restrictions. In ArchivesSpace, the left-hand area over here, the sidebar over there, it provides ways to navigate to different parts of the record. At the top of the record is always a basic information section, and in the accession record, a lot of the information is included in that basic information section. When you get further down, these are records that link to this specific record. They're subordinate to this specific record. They can't live on their own. Like a date record, subrecord wouldn't be free floating in the system. It has to be part of a specific accession record. But there are ways to do that so that you can record multiple sub-records of this type of information without having to repeat yourself. And you can link to many other types of records in ArchivesSpace as well. Within an accession record, you can also indicate information about deaccessioning. So if you have things that were not brought into the repository, but not retained, you can record that information in a deaccession record. You can also record information about the actual acquisition of it. So information about who donated it to, who donated the who donated the accession to you, and what their contact information is and things like that. So all of that information can be in an accession record in ArchivesSpace. Now, what may be a little bit unusual, so accessions are typically things that are brought into a repository, from the outside. They're brand new to the repository, and they might be considered unprocessed because like the additional work that people might do on records to make them available to a researcher isn't necessarily done at the time of accessioning. Now, certainly that has trended differently in the last few decades, and it is possible that people are doing processing at the same time that they're doing accessioning. It is possible that what they call accessioning is really processing. So even though, in earlier years, it may be that an accession record would never be seen outside of the repository, it is possible to publish accession records in ArchivesSpace. They can be published to our public interface, and it can be another way for people to access that information. I'm going to stop there for now. Does anyone have any questions about accessions in ArchivesSpace? Okay, I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Jessica.
All right, share my screen again. Okay, so I am going to talk about the section we're calling arrangement and description. So I'm going to go over resource records and then agent records and subject records, but not in that order. I'm going to do subjects before agents. So first, to talk about resource records. So this is a completed resource record within ArchivesSpace. Within the context of ArchivesSpace, resources are materials that are in the custody of an archival repository, and you are describing them according to archival principles. That's what a resource record is. We're more comfortable calling it the finding aid. The thing you're building here is the finding aid. It can be a resource record can represent a single item. So here, that's what's happening. This is the diary. So it's one single item, or it could be a whole collection, which is something we might be more comfortable talking about when we're talking about finding aid. So it could be a larger collection. It's just identified. This resource is identified by a title and an identifier. So it could be the collection of, or the Jessica Crouch papers, and that's your resource record, or it could just be a diary like it is here. But that is what it is. Either one is fine. And I'm going to show both. So for the purposes of just talking about resource records in general, or these top level resource records, I'm going to look at this item, which is a single item being described as a resource record. And then I'm going to move over to a collection that has a hierarchical description for a collection that's made up of many, many pieces. The resource record, so what we're looking at right now, this is where you're going to place the bulk of your information about the material. So this is where you are going to be describing the intellectual characteristics of the material, but it is also where you will describe the physical characteristics of the material. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. You can add a ton of descriptive elements. You can add, like Christine said, if you look here, you can see all of the elements of a resource record, just like in a session record that you can navigate to. There are many types of notes, right statements. You can link to different types of records like subjects and agents, which we will get into in a minute. You can really supplement and fill out a resource record with a lot of different options, especially in the notes fields. The way that you create a resource record, obviously you can hop over to create and select resource record. I'm going to very briefly mention that it is possible to create a new resource record by spawning. You would take an accession record that you created and select spawn from the menu there, the accession record, and spawn a new resource record. Spawning from an accession record does create a new resource record, but it does not transfer over all of the information you put into an accession record, and it also does not fill out every required field within a resource record, because the way you're describing an accession record is not going to be the way you're going to describe the material in a resource record. So just keep that in mind. Just because you spawn a record and create a new resource record, you have to fill out all of those required fields and hit save before the new resource record is created. It does require that manual intervention. So if you are asking your students to create an accession record and then move that accession record through to a resource record and they use spawning, they will need to save the record to be able to have something they can then display to you for grading. But I just wanted to point out that spawning is another possible way to create a resource record. But frequently you're just going to be going into the create menu and selecting it. Like I said, a lot of different elements that you can add to a resource record. There are some required fields though. So obviously a title here is required. You can tell it's required because of the red asterisks. An identifier is required. The level of description is required. That is not a free text field. That's a drop-down menu. And you know that this is described as a collection. It could have been described as an item. It's a collection. Your option for whether or not you want to publish is here. You'll be seeing these little checkboxes all throughout the demo. And in 1 second, I'll talk about your publish options. But if you want to publish the collection, you would select that here. That is not required, but I just want to point it out. Language is required. This is the language of the materials within the collection. So this collection, this diary is in English. Dates are required. And you, again, all the red asterisks, you can tell what's required because of the red asterisks. I will point out here, there's a gray asterisk. So whenever you see a gray asterisk in ArchivesSpace, that means that it is conditionally required. And the tooltip is going to explain to you what that condition is. So for this date expression with this conditional requirement, it's saying that if you are not using the machine readable begin and end dates here, you are required to use a date expression. You can use both, and there's a lot of good reasons to use a date expression, which is human readable, and a machine readable begin and end date, especially for like searching and that sort of thing. But it's going to require you to use one or the other. They've chosen to do both here, which is probably a good idea. And of course, you can have lots of different types of dates. You can have bulk dates, inclusive dates, that sort of thing, but we're not going to get into that. Anytime you open up a new field though, if I decided to add another date range here, you notice immediately I get new required fields. If I change my mind and like, oh, I don't need another date here, I'll just go ahead and save it. I'm going to get an error because I have opened up the possibility of more requirements. So you can always just confirm removal on that and not have the issue. Extent is also required, so the size of the collection. And then once you go down below extent, you get into the finding aid data. So for every other section within a resource record, you are talking about the materials. You're describing the materials within that collection. For the finding aid data, you are talking about the finding aid itself, the authoring of this document. So there are two required fields within the finding aid data section. That's the language of description and the script of description. Unlike the language field that is required earlier in the record, which is asking for the language the materials are in, language and script of description is asking you what language you wrote the finding aid in. So here it's Latin and script, or it's English and the script is Latin. And that's all you need to save a valid resource record. At that point, it is savable. You'll notice there's a few other asterisks here that look like they're required. That's because the agent link someone opened up the agent field, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. If you did not open up and try to add an agent, those requirements would not be there, so you can ignore them. This is all you need to create a valid and savable resource record. But Jessica, that is not what you resource record. So I'll just point that out here. Save your record in Archive. If you're creating an assignment you want them to create a DAX compliant record, keep in mind that they Christine, it says my internet is unstable.
Yeah, I was about to say, is Jessica fading in and out for other people? Yeah.
Oh no.
Do you want to give it another minute or so, and I can take over for you if needed?
Is that better?
I heard you like for the last half of a sentence.
Okay, so it was half better.
As long as I can hear half a sentence.
Okay. All right, can you hear me now?
I can hear you clearly right
Okay,
now.
okay, perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's cross some fingers. Otherwise, I'll jump in.
Okay. So what I was saying was the difference in what makes a savable ArchivesSpace record and what is required to create a DAX compliant record. You know, ArchivesSpace doesn't require a scope and contents note. It doesn't require conditions governing access note, that sort of thing. So if in your assignment you are expecting your students to create DAX compliant records, just keep in mind, just because they were able to save it in ArchivesSpace does not mean that they have fulfilled that requirement. ArchivesSpace tries to make it so that you're able to apply or use the application without having to adhere to one specific descriptive standard. So it's why it doesn't require all elements of a DAX to save the record. So I just wanted to point that out. Let's skip subjects. Please ignore those and agents. Please ignore those for now. But I wanted to briefly, and again, there's just so much stuff here we're not going to get into, but I did want to point out one other element of a resource record, and that is instances. This is an element of the application that confuses a lot of people because we are using terminology that is not familiar. However, the concept is very familiar. So instances represent the physical embodiment of the material. So this resource record is describing this diary at an intellectual level. It's describing the material that is represented in that diary. Then you take that diary and you probably put it in a box and you put that box on a shelf. Within ArchivesSpace, that box is an instance of this material. So, and that box is called a top container. A top container is the highest level of like confinement for a material. So you might have a letter that's in a sleeve, that's in a folder, that's in a box, and you could represent that by having a box with a child type of folder and then a grandchild type of sleeve. And, you know, you could get really granular, or you could just say it's in a box. And then it is possible to assign locations. We do not have any time to get into locations today, but I will say you can say, okay, this box 1 that relates back to this diary lives in this library on this shelf. And so that's why it's important to point out that when you're talking about the physical embodiment of the material, you should be describing that in instances in this subrecord. It should not be described within the title of the material or as a note or something like that. I mean, you could, if ArchivesSpace wouldn't stop you, but then you wouldn't be able to use all the features of the application. You wouldn't be able to do like a lot of searching and sorting. It would just that information would just kind of exist in this resource record. So I wanted to point that out. Another thing about instances is when you're describing something like this, so this diary, it exists as a physical diary in a box on a shelf somewhere, but let's say it also 20 years ago it got microfilmed and now it exists as a microfilm reel and it's in, you know, it slides whatever through whatever. You could then add an additional container instance and say this diary that I'm describing exists on this box and this shelf. It also exists on this microfilm reel in this drawer. And then maybe it got digitized last week. You can now add a digital object that I'll talk about later, linking out to your content management system. So you don't have to redescribe the material 3 different times. You just say this material exists in 3 different instances. So that's a very fast way to go over instances, but I wanted to point out that it is, when you're describing like where the material is being, how the material is being housed, you would do that through instances. And you'll see, I'm scrolling really fast, sorry. Up here at this high level information about this item, you'll see that the title of the item is here, the level of description is here, the material type is here, and then here is that box 1. So you should always be seeing the containment, the top container described here. Frequently I'll see, especially like with students and people starting out, they'll title it box 1. So I just wanted to point that out. It's very confusing in ArchivesSpace if you're not familiar with that terminology. And then finally, the last thing I'll point out is I've been messing around in this record, so it's asking me if I want to save it. I'm not going to save it, but once you do save a record, you will get this toolbar up here available to you where you can also do a whole bunch of other actions on your record, like adding an event. You can export it, you can merge it into another collection if you want to. That's something you would do irregularly. You could transfer it to another repository if it's going to change locations. And then you can also like use the space calculator, create assessments, that sort of stuff and more. You also notice here you have the ability to publish all or unpublish all. So if I finish my record, I'm very happy with it, I want everything that I've created to be publicly available, I can hit publish all and it will go to the PUI. I really like this feature, especially if you know all of the material is going to be publicly accessible and you're ready for it. However, keep in mind if there is maybe a series that should not be published or made available, or if there's one item that should be suppressed, publish all is not the way to go. You're going to want to go in and individually select those blue publish options. You also have the ability to unpublish all if you change your mind, and then view publish would take you out to the public user interface and would let you see what that published material would look like looks like now that it is published. And then finally, you have the option to suppress or delete records. Delete does that, and then suppress, if you have a record maybe you don't need everyone to see, or you don't want even returning in staff user interface results, you can suppress it, and then only people who have permission to see suppressed records will be able to see that. So that's what those toolbar functions do. Again, like I said, there's a ton of different information. You could really build out a very robust resource record, and if you have the time, that's awesome. But those are the required fields and some considerations for creating resource records. I'm going to move over and show what a hierarchical resource record looks like now. Oh my gosh, look at the time. Are there any questions about resource records before I very briefly show what the hierarchical record looks like in ArchivesSpace? Okay, seeing none, you can always hold on to them. So you just saw me move over, but I just moved into a different resource record in ArchivesSpace. So this is a resource record that has a hierarchy to it. So it is a collection, and then materials within the collection are described at the item and file level. You could elect to include series in this as well if you wanted, but for the purposes of this, they have a collection and then they're describing everything at the item level. And you can see here, just like we talked about, you see the title, you see the level of description, you see the material type, and then you see where it's housed. So you're able to sort of scroll down through the entire collection and look at it up here, or you can always just select one of these child records and look at it here. Within ArchivesSpace, we call these child records. So the records that are nested under that top level resource record, we call them archival object records. And you see that right there, archival object. To create archival object records, there are a lot of different ways to do it. Within the system itself, you can add a child, which would then create something nested under the record that you have open, and just make sure you're always in the record you want to have open. Or you could add a sibling, which would create something at the same level. You also have the ability to use a tool called rapid data entry to put in a lot of archival objects at the same time. No time to go over that, but there's a user tutorial video that I recommend. And then there's always the ability to load via spreadsheet. The main difference with archival objects compared to that main resource level or that main resource record is there's much fewer required fields. Still a ton of information you can include, lots of note fields, but all you need to include to save it is you need to have a level of description, so it could be your series, your file, your level of description, and then it needs to have, again, we got gray here, this is conditionally required. It needs to either have a title or a date. In most cases, you're probably going to have both, but it either needs to have a title or a date. If you this is another thing I see commonly in archivists using ArchivesSpace for the first time. If they do not have a title, they only have a date, their impulse is to put the date in the title. Don't do that. Put the date in the date, and then it will still show up where the title would normally be. So that's what the hierarchy looks like. Again, tons of resources available online. Okay, I've got 2 minutes. I'm going to
You can have 5 minutes, Jessica.
There's a lot. All right, so I'm going to move over very quickly to talk about subjects. So this is just the browse screen for subjects. Subject records are used to control information about exactly what you know, topics, geographic terms, genre, occupations, functions, and they're there to facilitate discovery of materials by linking them together. So the main thing to take away about subjects is that you only need to create one single subject for your entire ArchivesSpace implementation. So if, again, for student assignments, if you're asking them to create subjects, ideally they would not be going and creating the same subject over and over again. They would be creating unique subjects and then linking back to each other. Subjects and agents are both shared across repositories. So again, one repository does not need to create subjects that have already been created, and then you're linking to the same subject and pulling all of that material together. You do have the ability to create subjects based on whatever local source you have. So you can create a subject, pull it out of thin air if you want. But obviously these will work best if you are using some sort of control vocabulary or a standard thesauri. So you see here the most commonly used sources, Library of Congress subject heading, because this is being pulled from so many different organizations who have labeled their subject headings differently. It's represented differently, but these are the sources that have been referenced, and you see even local source here. Very quickly, let's open up a subject record. The only required fields here are your source, which it can always be local source, but like I said, if it's standardized, it's better, and you can have an authority ID to reflect back what standard you're pulling from. And then obviously you have to have your term. So you would put your term here, and your term type you would select here. I will briefly mention that if you are trying to add a term subdivision, like I'm interested in students specifically in South Carolina, an impulse is to do it like this. My impulse starting out, especially if you've spent any time cataloging, you should not do it that way. You should open up a new term subdivision and put your term there and select the appropriate type. Another impulse that people frequently have is to provide the punctuation. You do not need to provide the punctuation for subjects. All right, there's more to say about subjects, but I'm moving on. All right, agents, pretty much everything I just said applies to agents as well. Agents are a little more complex. The record for agents is much larger. I'm going to go ahead and pull one up, and I will point out, you see that these two people who are represented here, these are users within ArchivesSpace. Every user within ArchivesSpace has an agent record because they are taking action and have an impact on the record. So everyone has a record, an agent record in ArchivesSpace that is using your ArchivesSpace implementation. For students, it doesn't matter as much as it probably does if you're using it in the wild and you have someone leave. You don't want to delete their agent record because you still want to have a record of everything they did in the system, so you can blame them for mistakes later. So agent records are used to identify people, family, corporate entities, and software that have a specific specific relationship to material. So what I will say here, and the most important thing, if you remember anything about agents, is an agent, a person, can be the subject of a collection, but they are never a subject in ArchivesSpace. They're still a person, even if they are the subject of a collection. So again, another impulse is to create a subject record for a person, and because they are the subject of a collection, they should still be an agent. They should still be an agent record. Then whenever you are in your resource record, let's move back over here, and you have an agent, you link your agent record here, and then you assign them a role. So her role here is as creator because it's her diary. But if maybe she was talking a bunch of smack about someone, you could assign them as the subject of this diary. So that is how you make a person a subject of a collection. You do not create them as a subject record. That is something that I see very frequently, which is why I pointed out. Maybe if we stop it in the classroom, it won't happen in practice. But if you look in the at an agent record, it is much more robust than a subject record. I will point out the basic information here is just the agent type and the publish checkbox, yes or no. If you would like for your agents to be publicly available, you have to hit that publish. Some people include donor information, like their donors are listed as agents, and they may have contact information or things they don't want the public to see there. So that's why you need to opt to publish your agents or not. The record control information, this is about the record itself. This assumes that you're going to be taking this information and maybe sharing it with another system or something like that. So that's what all this record control information is for. The identity information is specific to the person, obviously. The only required fields for an agent are down here. It's where you have to include the primary part of name and the name order, which in this case is indirect. You see here they use local sources to create this record, but they use the rules based on DAX. under that identity information, there's some descriptive information about the person that you can include, and then there's some relation information. So if this person is part of a family that you collect everyone in that family, maybe they have a sibling or a parent, you can link back and say this is the sibling of, this is the husband of, that sort of thing. And then related external resources is, let's say this collection is processed within ArchivesSpace, but you have another collection related to this person that you haven't gotten around to yet, and you want to link out to your website or something like that, or if maybe they have a collection at another institution. So agent records are much more robust, but you only have to include that little bit of information. And the last thing I will say is, there is a way to minimize the amount of information viewable here and through a light mode, but that is something that has to be turned on or off in the config file. So that's not something that, to start out with, to enable it, that's not something that you can do in the staff user interface. Any questions about that? Okay. You ready to switch off, Christine? Oh wait, it's me.
It's you. That's
Oh
why
my
I was
God.
very generous to give you some extra
Oh wow,
time.
thank you for.
It's your section, but
my
you
section.
can still extend 5 minutes into my section. That's fine.
And that's why you were so, yeah, go ahead, take all the time you need. All right, any questions about what I just covered before we move into digital objects? Digital objects is going to be a little bit different, so I want to make sure I cover anything now. I'd rather clarify now than keep everyone in the dark. Okay, all right, so seeing none, I'm going to move over to talking about digital objects within ArchivesSpace. So again, the primary takeaway, if you're doing other things while you're listening to this, which I assume you are, the thing to remember is that ArchivesSpace is not a digital asset management system. So you cannot ingest or store digital materials in ArchivesSpace. ArchivesSpace supports the management of your digital object metadata, and I'll show that in just a second. So that way you can manage your archival holdings in one system. So you have all of your physical materials represented in your resource records, and then you have all of your digital objects represented in your digital object records. And you can then link those together. Like I was saying earlier, if that diary had been digitized, you could add an instance, a digital object instance that links out to wherever that is stored. Improves accessibility and discoverability of your collections, but the material themselves is not being stored in ArchivesSpace. The assumption is it's going to be stored somewhere else. It might be in a digital asset management system. It might be on a server at your repository, that sort of thing. Digital objects, let's move over to one. So digital objects, you can export those out as METs, mods, and Dublin core. So again, for purposes of the classroom, if you want people to provide you any metadata in METs, mods, or Dublin core, creating something in the digital objects module will be the way to go if you're having them author it in ArchivesSpace. Whereas if you want them to do export something in MARC or EAD, then you're going to want them to be working in the resource record module. I am not going to spend a lot of time getting into the digital object fields just in the interest of time, but I will point out that obviously what is required. So you're required to have a title and an identifier, and then you're required to have a file URI. So the file URI is that link, that thing that takes you out, or the link that takes you to where the material is being stored. So here they're just keeping it in a Dropbox drive, which is perfectly fine from an ArchivesSpace standpoint. This may be because this specific exhibit guide is not actually something that's available for public consumption. That might just be something that they're keeping for internal use. So it's perfectly fine to have it on a Dropbox. And then but for your materials that you're making publicly available, maybe you're using a digital asset management system like Omeka or something like that, and then that would link out there. You just need to make sure that you are using a file URI and that it is renderable, especially if you are trying to publish it. You don't want to have something on a server where the link is dead, because you have to have certain permissions to have access to it. So those are the required elements of a digital object, but there's a lot more that you could include just in terms of like file management. I'm not going to get into the Xlink actuate and show attributes, other than I'll just say that determines how the link renders, basically. So whether or not you want it to open in a new window, whether or not you want it to open in the current window, that sort of thing. But you can look in the documentation about that. And then then it starts to look very similar, right? Like you get a lot of those subnotes that we were already talking about that you can really build out if you want to flesh out your digital objects. What I really want to point out about digital objects is that you can construct your digital objects either as simple digital objects or complex digital objects. So this item that we're looking at right now is a simple digital object. So it's one in which the intellectual content is contained in one digital file. So here, even though I'm going to assume this exhibit guide is many pages, it is a simple digital object because the link itself it's one digital file. So this could be, I mean, you could digitize Moby Dick and it would be, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. But if the PDF was one single PDF, that would be a simple digital object. You are describing this one single file, this one single digital file here. So there's this single level in structure. So if you're thinking back to the resource records I showed, that's why it looks very much like that diary that we looked at. It's sort of just like a simple single level item. A complex digital object, I'm going to move over to one, is one in which you have two or more digital content files. So that's what we're looking at now. It's a digital collection. It's got several digital files, and you see here with each of these archival or these digital archival objects, you see the links to the individual digital files. So that's what a complex digital object is. It's a version, it's multi-level in structure. It's got that same parent-child relationship that we see in the resource records. And each one of those children has their own file. So for example, going back to that diary, like I said, if you digitize that diary and made it a single PDF, you could describe it as a simple digital object. If you digitize that diary and every single page was its own standalone PDF, that's when you would need to build out a complex digital object, because you would be creating that file structure and representing like the pages within the diary are represented as individual files. You can do either one in ArchivesSpace. You can do both in ArchivesSpace. You don't have to adopt one way or the other. You can, you know, whatever is best for the individual record that you're working with. One thing, just another caveat before I see if there's any questions. If you are creating complex digital objects like this one here, they will export as your METS-MODs in Dublin Core. But let's say that these photographs of North Carolina and Georgia retail shops, let's say I had a physical collection about this and I wanted to link back in the instances to this material, you would only be linking to the one single resource record there. So let's say later on, I go to export the EAD for that specific collection. The EAD is not going to then export out this hierarchical complex digital object. So if you are more interested in exporting EAD, then this complex digital object complicates that, and simple digital objects are probably the way to go, using simple digital objects to link them back to your collection as an instance. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, is like, how do you want to, what kind of data are you trying to get out of ArchivesSpace, and how you plan to do that, and that will impact how you build your digital objects. But otherwise, it's really up to you if you'd like to build them as simple or complex. Any questions about that? I went really fast on digital objects.
It was a whirlwind tour of ArchivesSpace, but impressive, Jessica. Okay, so I will take over for this last section related to what we're calling reference access and outreach. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that people provide access to the information and the collection information specifically that they've put into ArchivesSpace. So I mentioned that, you know, there are some shared values of our community, and that one of our shared values is that things be flexible, that you not be tied into doing something only one way, or even if you choose to do something, that you're not tied into doing it that way forever. So ArchivesSpace does provide a number of different options for providing access to the information that's in the system. The simplest is to just use the public user interface that's built into ArchivesSpace. And Jessica showed you that, and she talked about, that it's a discovery interface, but it's pretty basic. You can search for things, you can browse for things, you can see the information in context, this hierarchical description that's being created in ArchivesSpace. Our public user interface can present that information in the hierarchy. The public user interface is customizable, but it's, you are tied into certain decisions that have been made as a community about what information should be presented and how. But you wouldn't need to put together any other kind of system if you use the public interface as the way that you present information about your collections. So that's one strategy that a lot of places do use. Another strategy that people use is to export information out of the system. And they may use that strategy because they've already invested a lot of information, a lot of energy into a different system that may have preceded ArchivesSpace. They may have invested a lot of resources into a system that they're creating now. For whatever reason, like our public interface doesn't really meet their needs, or they want to use the public interface alongside this other system that they use. The other system may be something that they have built or manage at their own institution, or it may be something that they participate in with other institutions, like a finding aid aggregator. So for whatever reason, it makes sense for them to export records out of ArchivesSpace to use with that system. Some places also export records, not even for use in a system, but to they may have, a pretty basic level of access that they provide to their researchers that works for them. So it may be they just want to put a set of PDFs out there, and they don't really need an additional search interface on top of that, or Google, Google indexing does the job for them. So we do provide a lot of different exports within ArchivesSpace. Jessica mentioned some of them as she went along with talking about the different parts of ArchivesSpace. So I'm on a resource record right now, and we do have multiple EAD exports that you can get out. You can get out EAD 2002, or you can get out EAD 3, depending on what you need. We also have MARC XML exports for resources. These would often be used if people want to be able to make the information from ArchivesSpace also available in their library's online catalog. So, as a single access point for all the collections, all the types of materials at their institution, library material as well as archival material. Most library systems are still based on MARC. And so MARC provides, being able to have a MARC export, being able to send that over to that system is important to them. And then we also, as Jessica said, for our digital content, we have some other specifically digital metadata standard exports. So for Dublin Core, for METs, for mods, it is possible to use those in conjunction with other specifically digital content or digital asset management systems that need that kind of metadata. Or you can also, for the digital content, again, as Jessica said, you can export EAD information out as well. As long as you accept, some of the limitations of what digital content, digital object information metadata can come out through EAD. So we have those. We have exports where you can export out single records. We also have the possibility for people to grab like a whole bunch of records at the same time. We have OAI PMH streams that people can use. They will often use those to interact specifically with a library catalog or with a finding aid aggregator, something where a whole bunch of records that meet a certain set of criteria can be pulled in an automated way and put into the other system. We also have our API, which is a common point of integration with other systems. So it is based on JSON, and so people can use the API to grab a whole bunch of records, put them into a different system, or grab a whole bunch of records to have them work with their own style sheets to put them up on the web, or also to do like some a little bit slightly more sophisticated data analysis or slightly more sophisticated bulk editing types of operations. Our API is a good strategy for that. In recent years, so Jessica showed you our agent record is fairly lengthy, and there's a lot of information that can be recorded in that. We did that in order to be able to interact with systems that that people use for recording information. And specifically, a lot of the improvements were made along the lines of being able to get EAC CPF records out of ArchivesSpace. So those EAC CPF records specifically can be used with SNAC, social networks in archival context, that system, as well as if people have other reasons that they use EAC CPF records. This is another case also where MARC still rules the library world in lots of places. So we also now have provided the ability to get MARC XML authority records out of ArchivesSpace, in addition to the MARC bibliographic records that have been possible from the beginning. So I think those are the main things that I wanted to cover about ways people get information, provide access to the information in ArchivesSpace to researchers and to others. We do have, because there's so many collection management functions in ArchivesSpace, it is also possible to record information about how your, exhibits that you're doing, or other sorts of outreach purposes that you're using your collection material for. But ArchivesSpace is not an exhibition presentation system, which is another important thing to know, that it is not. So I think that we've reached the end of this whirlwind tour of ArchivesSpace. Do you have any questions about these specific functions that we've just shown you, or about ArchivesSpace in general? I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn my camera back on.
I can't believe we did it.
I know this is, you all may not be impressed by the fact that we're impressed by ourselves, but we are impressed with ourselves. We're also happy to answer questions about, I know at least one of you mentioned that you had questions about the educational sandboxes that you have and how your students can access information from the Help Center and things like that. So we're also happy to answer questions about that.
Hi there, this is Karen. I can turn on my video. I didn't want to, we were having bandwidth issues, so I didn't want to have the video on. So I agree with Heather. It's just like, woo, we whipped through a lot. I think it, really, the one thing it did was show us all the, various things that ArchivesSpace can do, that some of which I didn't realize. And, we'll show the students how comprehensively you can manage things that have, traditionally been done in so many different ways using so many different tools. I still talk to a lot of people that, their default is an Excel spreadsheet for everything. And it's just like, okay, well, yeah, I guess, for the students, they have the potential to be overwhelmed as well. And sometimes when you tell people, like, once you get over the hump of adopting something like this, you're going to find it's worth it. But, depending on what sort of organization or institution they're in. But so, sorry, those are just some general comments. but I'm thinking towards, I have started the archival description course that I want to use an exercise for that helps the students learn more about ArchivesSpace. And so given, this is not a simple tool, this is not a 20-minute exercise and they've mastered it, haha. So it's kind of trying to decide what to have them do. It's obviously focused on archival description in this course. And I was looking through the workbook and I see that you have exercises, which I imagine they're not just written for us, even though it's labeled as being for, I mean, is it possible? Obviously, I would, give you attribution to adapt some of that material for our own purposes.
It's absolutely possible. That this is, as you said, it's a complex tool. There are a lot of parts to it. But also we want people to take away that you don't have to implement all of it at once. You don't have to be an expert in every single part of it. So that is one of the principles of the ArchivesSpace community, is that you should be able to start small and grow over time. So absolutely, the workbook information that's there, you're welcome to adapt it for your own purposes. It may be helpful if you do that, to share it with the wider archival education community as well, because probably lots of your colleagues have the same sort of things that they're facing and ways that they want to figure out how they can adapt this to make sense for their student.
Yeah, I haven't looked through all of the exercises yet, but I was already going, oh, I have them do that, but just not in a system, like, creating a basic, what's the word they use? Sorry, I have to go back now and back to the first exercise. Oh, no, I guess I wasn't excited. All right, I don't know where I saw it. I'll have to look again. But basically the difference between a single level and a multi-level record for DAX kind of thing. I wish I've had them do an exercise for a year on that, for years. And it's like, oh, I can do that using, they can go directly into ArchivesSpace. I was initially thinking, because I had to get my course ready before this training took place, that I would just have them do one single exercise. But I'm thinking that in future iterations of my course, things I used to have them do purely by hand, some of them I could potentially have them do within ArchivesSpace. So they'd have multiple exposures to the system rather than just one. So those are just some of my thoughts. I mean, there were questions that popped up as I was listening, just really silly things like, oh, I see there's an accession number and does it support multiple numbering systems? Well, obviously it must, because there's multiple boxes. So if you have different collection numbers from accession numbers, it sounds like that's supported.
Absolutely. And so specifically for accessions and for resources, you can put together accessions in different sort of chunks, the identifier in different chunks. So it may be that you have a certain chunk that is always the same for all of your accessions, but there's other chunks that are different, based on which repository it's in, or what type of material it is, or things like that, or when in the year it was received. So absolutely, you can do that.
One other question that another smaller one, but so looking ahead towards the subjects and the agents and all of that, is there a way to do a bulk load of list of names, list of topics, or is it something you have to create each record individually, one at a time?
Jessica, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So there are a couple different ways to do that. So one way to do it is through that the plugin. I can't talk anymore. Through the plugin, yeah, LCNA. So in the plugin, just go to the plugin. You can search there for Library of Congress subject terms and name authority files, and you can as you're finding the records that you want, you can sort of build out and add as many as you want into like the import, and then it'll run a background job and import all of those records. One of the things that is either very good or very bad about that is that it also will bring over related terms. So if, for example, like if you were to import in Joe Biden, it's going to bring in a lot of related terms about like the presidency and stuff like that.
Okay.
So that's a way to get things in bulks through that plugin. Also, anytime you're importing a record into ArchivesSpace, like if you're importing a resource record through load via spreadsheet or any of that functionality, if you have it within that spreadsheet, if you have assigned a agent or subject records, they will get imported there as well. So that's one easy way to get things in bulk, is to use the templates to basically import in a ton of subjects and agents, and then you just have them already pre-populated in your your vocabulary.
That was what I thought, because I know there's lots of repositories that have their own internal lists that they've built up over probably decades and decades.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so it's like the being able to, you know, create that pick list or whatever, however it works, search, you know, be able to search and just grab it, would be a huge time saver. I imagine, yeah, it has the potential of introducing a lot of I don't know, errors or unwanted extras, but you know, anything that would keep somebody from having to create, you know, 5,000 agent records or whatever, you know, subject records would be awesome.
Well, and Karen, you mentioned how like people are very tied to their spreadsheets. Just because ArchivesSpace exists doesn't mean that people still aren't tied to their spreadsheets. So we do have, there's been a lot of additional spreadsheet functionality built into ArchivesSpace over the years, where people can bring things into a resource record in bulk. And there's also community development that has happened around being able to bulk update records that are already in ArchivesSpace, but people want to be able to pull them down, make changes outside of the system, and then put them back. So there definitely are those kinds of things.
All this stuff, it's usually the sorts of things you never learn how to do until you actually are in the job, because it's kind of hard to teach that kind of stuff.
Exactly. So, and you know, we work with ArchivesSpace in a certain way, but we typically aren't using it to solve real world problems right now. So our users teach us a lot about kinds of ways that they've adapted it to solve the problems that they have in their repositories.
All right, I've been hogging the question and answer session, so I'll let one of my colleagues step forward if they have some questions.
I might have missed this, we might have glossed over it in the presentation, which thanks, by the way, it was a very good overview in a condensed period of time. But is there a way to include digital object records in complex resource records? I guess would like doing, so I'm thinking of just like, you know, hybrid collections that come in that have both paper and digital materials together.
Yeah.
Would that be using like that instance feature of like having an instance of like?
Yeah, exactly. So if you can either, and we didn't have time to go into it, you can either go into the digital object module and create a digital object through the create dropdown, you know, like I showed how you can do that. You also can create a digital object from within your resource record. So if you are doing what you're describing, you've got this hybrid collection, you can, in the resource record, you can say, I have this photograph, you can describe it in an archival object record. And then but the instance, instead of being a box one folder, whatever, the instance is going to be a digital object instance, and it's going to link out to wherever that is stored. So you could have, in theory, you could have an archival object record where its only instance is a digital file, or you can have an archival object instance where it's material that has been digitized. So it would have a physical instantiation and a digital object attached to it. So you could do it both ways. The thing about complex versus simple there is that when you are doing that, what you're describing, those are going to be simple digital objects. Like every time you're creating those are going to be simple digital objects. as opposed to if you're building out a complex digital object, you're not going to be able to link it in the same way. So that it just gets into a lot of, I mean, honestly, like internal practice decisions about how you want to represent that stuff, which obviously students, I mean, like Karen said, it's like that stuff you don't get into until you're in it, but making those sorts of internal process decisions about how you want to handle your digital objects. But yeah, you can absolutely do what you're describing.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. I did another question about accessing the help center as a student. So does that access, as soon as they get like a user account in the ArchivesSpace sandbox, does that, I guess they need to set up separate accounts for like the help center and for the.
Yeah. So the archives, your ArchivesSpace sandbox, any account they have in that would be separate from the help center account. So in the sandbox, it would be up to you as the instructor if you want to go in and create an account for every single student, or if you want to create some kind of generic accounts, or however you want to do that. But for the help center account, they'll need to, and I think that then they have the instructions for that, but they need to create their own help center account. So what happens is they go in and they create that Atlassian account, and we get notification that an account has been created. They need to use their institutional email address. That's how we determine whether or not they're associated with this membership. And so make sure you point that out to your students. But once they create that account, we'll go in and say, oh, they're part of the Ed program membership, and we'll give them access to the help center. So, and that normally takes 1 to 2 days because it's kind of a manual process, but they'll have access to the help center after that. Every 6 months, we go in and we clear out the Ed program members. So if you're doing some sort of course that takes multiple semesters, or if a student happens to take a couple classes that use ArchivesSpace, they'll have to do it again. But otherwise, yeah, they should have access to the help center for 6 months.
Awesome, thank you.
Are there any other questions? So we certainly recognize that we're so glad you joined us here today, but depending on, where you are with when you're going to teach this course, or, what other things that you're working on right now, it may be a while before you actually go back and touch ArchivesSpace, or before you work with students on it. So our hope is that by the resources that we're providing to you in the workbook, and in the agenda, and in the help center, of course, that when you get back to it and you're ready to dive in again, you have the things that you need. And then you're also welcome, of course, to reach out to us at any point, and we're happy to give you information too.
Thanks so much. This has been really helpful.
Heather and I both jumped in at the same time, but yes, totally same thing Heather said, just said.
Glad to hear it. Please do, we put it on your agenda, we put a link for an evaluation of this session. Please do fill that out. So this was our first time doing this. We would be very happy to do future ones, but we would love to get a sense of, what was helpful, what was not so helpful, how much tolerance there is for a longer session, things like that. It'd be great to hear from you about that. We did record this session, so we will send out the recording later on as well. And you're welcome to share that with colleagues as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and take care. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.